All right, let's dive in. We're about to pull back the curtain on something we've all come across, something that gets passed around in whispers at sleepovers, in those old forwarded emails, and all over our social media feeds: the urban legend. You know the ones I'm talking about, right? These stories feel so incredibly real, so close to home. They're basically the ghost stories of our modern world, just swapping out the campfire for the glow of a phone screen. They're tailor-made to send a chill down your spine, to make you double-check the backseat of your car. So, let's actually get into that. Because these stories aren't just random bits of spooky fun. No, they're carefully constructed pieces of modern folklore. And in this explainer, we're going to dissect their anatomy piece by piece.
And the first step in any good dissection is defining what's actually on the table. Before we can figure out how they work, we really need to get on the same page about what they are. So, an urban legend isn't some ancient myth about gods and monsters. It's a story built for our time. You could almost say it's folklore that wears a leather jacket, folklore that knows its way around a smartphone. Its real power comes from the fact that it feels like it could happen, right now, just down the street.
And this, right here, is the secret sauce. See, unlike a myth that's set in some far-off divine past or a folktale that we all know is just make-believe, the entire engine of an urban legend runs on one thing: plausibility. It's told as if it's fact, happening to real people in a world that looks exactly like ours. And that's its most powerful weapon. Okay, so if these stories feel so real, how did they travel before you could just smash that share button? Well, for decades, sociologists studied a very specific, very human way they got around. Let's break that down. This is the absolute key to the classic urban legend, the friend of a friend, or FOAF for short. Think about it. The story is never told by the person it happened to. It's always a friend's cousin, a coworker's brother, a neighbor's sister. This creates just enough distance that you can't check the facts, but it also pulls a powerful psychological trick. It gives the story this crucial badge of authenticity. So this is how that classic chain works. It all starts with some alleged event. Then that story gets attached to the witness, the friend of a friend who's always just one step removed. From there, it gets to the narrator, the person telling you the story. And finally, it lands with you, the listener. So now the decision is yours. Do you break the chain or do you pass it on? It's a simple system, but unbelievably effective. But here's the thing. These legends aren't just random happenings. They almost always follow familiar patterns, kind of like movie genres. And they're shaped this way for a very specific reason: to get a message across as clearly and powerfully as possible. And two of the most common types are the cautionary tale, which is basically designed to warn us about dangers and reinforce social rules, and the poetic justice tale, where a bad person gets some kind of bizarre and perfectly fitting punishment. They're both all about creating a sense of order in a chaotic world. Yeah, this idea of a closed justice system is ancient. And as this source points out, it's perfectly captured in a story like Little Red Riding Hood. The message is simple, almost brutal. There are rules. If you break them, the consequences are on you. So many urban legends work in the exact same way. They just swap out the dark woods for a dark parking lot and the big bad wolf for a more modern-day threat. For decades, that friend of a friend model was the only engine, and it moved at the speed of a human voice. But then, a new technology came along that was like pouring rocket fuel on that engine. I mean, just think about it. A story could maybe travel across a town or even a state, but it would take weeks, maybe months. It was a slow burn, passed from person to person in conversations, on phone calls, maybe even in letters. The internet didn't invent urban legends. Not at all. But what it did was perfect their delivery system. It took that human chain and just supercharged it, creating a global network for our modern folklore. And all of a sudden, these brand new engines of transmission popped up. That FWD, FWD, FWD at the top of an email, that became the new friend of a friend, a digital badge of authenticity. Then, online forums and later social media let these stories leap across continents in an instant, twisting and evolving with every new community they infected. So the acceleration is really the key takeaway here. A story that once took weeks to cross a country can now literally circle the globe in the time it takes you to read this sentence. The scale and the speed are just on a completely different level, and it's changed the very nature of how these legends live and breathe. So let's step back for a second. We've just dissected the anatomy of these modern myths. We've looked at the blueprint for how they're built and how they get around, both in the classic old school model and in our hyper-connected world today. So let's just put all the pieces together. At their core, urban legends are modern folklore, and they're built on a foundation of plausibility. Their classic delivery system, that friend of a friend model, gives them that all-important badge of authenticity. And finally, the internet took that person-to-person model and strapped a giant rocket to it. But here's the thing. Understanding all the mechanics, that only answers how these stories spread. It doesn't get to the deeper and, frankly, more interesting question, why? Why do we as humans have this fundamental need to tell and to listen to these often terrifying or bizarre tales? Well, that's a question of psychology. And in our next segment, we're going to dive right into why we love them so much.
Let's be honest, there's a part of us that loves to be scared. We're just drawn to those stories that make our skin crawl and our hearts pound, right? But what is it, deep down, that makes these terrifying tales so irresistible? So, last time, we really took apart the engine of modern myths. We saw how they're built and how they spread like wildfire. But knowing how they work just makes the why even more fascinating. And the answer, as it turns out, is a pretty wild look into our own psychology.
So to really get why these stories give us goosebumps as individuals, we've actually got to zoom out first. We need to understand the role they play for us as a whole society. Because before a legend scares you, it's doing a much bigger job.
I want you to think of an urban legend as a mirror that a whole culture is holding up to itself. But it's not a normal mirror. It's more like one of those funhouse mirrors, you know? It reflects back a distorted, kind of weird, wobbly version of what that community is collectively freaked out about. Legends basically point a giant arrow at a society's weak spots.
And let's be really clear about what we're talking about here. This isn't your personal fear of spiders or heights. Societal anxiety is way bigger. It's that humming background unease that comes from huge changes or moral panics that affect all of us. It's the stuff we worry about together.
And you can literally watch how that mirror reflects different things over time. I mean, think back to the 1980s. There was this huge panic about stranger danger, right? Well, that was the perfect breeding ground for those legends about razors and poison and Halloween candy. Now, fast forward to today, what are we worried about? Our privacy, our data, technology that feels like it's out of our control. So of course, the legends adapt. Now we have these stories about our smart devices listening to every single word we say.
So this brings us to a really crucial point. These stories, they have a job to do. They're basically giant, community-wide cautionary tales. That story about the Halloween candy? It's a not-so-subtle way of saying, don't trust strangers. The legend about the smart speaker, it's a warning, be careful with new technology. They're kind of a sneaky form of social control, using our biggest fears to guide how we behave. Okay, so that covers the big societal why. But it doesn't really explain why you and I find them so compelling, does it? Why do these stories get lodged in our brains and just refuse to leave? This is the next layer of the onion we have to peel back. We've got the group psychology down, but what is going on inside our own heads that makes us not only fall for these stories, but actually get a kick out of them and want to pass them on? What makes them so sticky?
Well, psychologists have figured out that it basically comes down to a simple two-part recipe. For a story to really grab hold of your brain and not let go, it needs two things: a big, powerful emotional punch, and it has to feel just believable enough.
First up, emotion. Think about it. Our brains are wired to remember things that make us feel something powerful. And when it comes to legends, fear and disgust are the absolute heavy hitters. These feelings act like superglue for our memory. You might forget what you had for breakfast, but you are definitely going to remember the story that made your stomach turn. And second, plausibility. And honestly, this is the secret sauce. This is what separates an urban legend from a ghost story or a fairy tale. A legend works because it feels like it's happening in our world. There are no dragons or magic wands. No, this story happens at the local mall, or on a dark road you've driven down, or in a dorm room just like yours. That's what makes it so terrifying. It feels like it could actually happen to you.
Okay, which brings us to the final, and maybe the weirdest part of this whole psychological puzzle. If these things are designed to scare us, why do we go looking for them? I mean, it's a huge paradox, isn't it?
Everything in our biology is supposed to make us run away from danger, to avoid threats. And yet, here we are, leaning in, telling our friends, you have to hear this story. What is going on with us?
Probably the best way to think about it is this. An urban legend is basically a roller coaster for your brain. It's a machine that's designed from the ground up to simulate mortal danger, and we happily get in line and pay for a ticket.
See, a legend gives us the best of both worlds. We get that chemical thrill, the shot of adrenaline, the racing heart that comes with a real threat. But, and this is the key, we get to experience it all from a totally safe distance. We can poke at our deepest anxieties without any real risk. We get the scare, but we always know that when the ride is over, the story ends, and we are perfectly okay.
And there's one last little benefit. Sharing these stories is a powerful social tool. When you tell a friend some shocking new legend you just heard, you're not just telling a story. You're giving them a token of membership. It's like a secret handshake. It signals you're both in the same group, that you're in the know. It's a weird way of bonding over a shared secret and a shared scare.
So, when you put it all together, the whole picture comes into focus. Legends aren't just silly campfire stories. They're these fascinating mirrors of what we're all worried about. And they're packaged in a way that our brains are just hardwired to remember and share, thanks to that killer combo of raw emotion and just enough plausibility. And we love them because they give us a safe way to play with our fears.
But you know what? That's enough theory. It's time to put these classic stories on the operating table ourselves. We've talked about them, but in our next explainer, we're going to talk to them. We are going to find out what really makes The Vanishing Hitchhiker and The Killer in the Backseat so absolutely timeless. You won't want to miss it.
All right, settle in. We've picked out 4 of the most famous legends out there, and we're going to tell them in order to kind of watch how our fears have changed over time. We're going to start our journey on a lonely highway, then creep up to the home telephone, and finally we'll end up in the darkest corners of the internet. Let's begin. So our first story takes us back to the golden age of the automobile, a time when a car meant freedom, it meant privacy, and for young couples, it meant a place to finally be alone. But with all that freedom came this brand new kind of fear. The fear of being totally isolated, just one pair of headlights in a huge, dark world. So picture this. It's a perfect night. A young couple, they've driven out to the local lover's lane. It's this secluded spot, with a great view of the city lights way down below. The car radio is playing something soft. The windows are all steamed up. It's just their own perfect private little world. And then, all of a sudden, the music cuts out. A crackling sound, and then this grim announcer's voice fills the car. A dangerous patient, he says, has just escaped from the state asylum just over the hill. The announcer describes him as a killer and says he's easy to identify because of the crude, sharp, steel hook where his right hand should be. The girl is instantly terrified. She wants to leave, like right now. The boy, he's trying to be cool, trying to be brave. He tells her it's nothing. The asylum's miles away. But then they both hear it. A faint sound, but it's unmistakable. Scrape, scrape, scrape. A slow, rhythmic scratching right against the passenger side door. The girl starts to totally panic, just begging him to start the car. He's annoyed, but he's also pretty unnerved himself. So he guns the engine, the tires spin on the gravel, and he just tears away from the overlook, speeding back towards town. He drives her home in this angry silence and drops her off at her front porch without saying a word. As she gets out, he peels away. It's only when he gets all the way home, under the safe, bright light of his garage, that he gets out to look at the passenger door, and that's when he sees it. Dangling from the handle, glinting in the light, is a bloody steel hook. All right, deep breath. For our next story, you'll see how the fear starts to evolve. It moves away from the outside world, from that dark highway, and it invades the one place we're all supposed to feel the safest, our own home. The threat isn't some monster you can just drive away from anymore. Now, it can get to you right through the telephone line. So a teenage girl is babysitting for this rich family in a huge, sprawling house she's never been in before. The kids are finally asleep upstairs. She settles down on the couch to watch some TV, enjoying the total silence of the house around her, and then the phone on the end table rings. The sound is so shrill it makes her jump out of her skin. She answers it, and there's this man's coarse voice on the other end. He breathes heavily for a second,
And then he just asks this simple, terrifying question. Have you checked the children? She thinks it's a prank call, and she slams the phone down. But a few minutes later, it rings again. It's him. Have you checked the children? Only his tone is way more menacing this time.
Okay, now she is genuinely scared. She calls the police. The operator is nice, but says there's not much they can do. Look, the operator says, if he calls again, you have to keep him on the line for at least a minute so we can trace it. We'll be ready. So the babysitter just sits there, staring at the phone, just praying it doesn't ring. But of course, it does. It's the man asking the same question. But this time, she keeps him on the line. She asks him who he is, what he wants. Just when she feels like she can't take it for another second, the operator breaks in on the line and her voice is frantic. She is screaming, "We've traced the call. You have to get out of the house now. The calls are coming from inside the house." From the phone, upstairs?
And now we move into the digital age. Our third story wasn't born around a campfire. Nope, it was born on an internet forum. This is a story about a fear that's kind of unique to our time. The fear that our own memories, the very things that make us who we are, can be corrupted, or maybe were never real to begin with.
It all started with a single, innocent-looking post on an online forum called Net Nostalgia. A user asks a simple question. Does anyone remember this kid's show from the 70s? I think it was called Cove.
And then, slowly, other users start to chime in. Oh my God, yes, I remember that show. And they start piecing together these strange, half-forgotten details. A really timid puppet named Pirate Percy, a horrifying villain called the Skin Taker, who was basically a skeleton who wore a cape made of children's skin. And then, the most disturbing memory of all, an entire episode where the puppets just did nothing but flail around and scream in agony. The memory is hazy, it's unsettling, but it's shared. They all remember it.
So they're all bonding over this strange, dark part of their childhoods. And then, one user posts the final, devastating message. They write, "You guys, I asked my mom about it, and she got this really weird look on her face. She told me, 'Honey, I don't know what you're talking about. You used to say you were going to watch Cove, but then you would just tune the TV to a dead static channel and watch the screen for a full 30 minutes.
Our final story. This one feels like it was clawed up from the deepest, darkest archives of the web. It doesn't even present itself as a story. It's framed as a leaked scientific document, a cold, clinical, terrifying account of an experiment so inhumane it had to be buried forever. The document supposedly details a secret Soviet experiment from back in the late 1940s. Researchers wanted to test out this experimental stimulant gas that could, in theory, eliminate the need for sleep entirely. So they sealed 5 political prisoners inside a chamber, and they promised them their freedom if they could just stay awake for 30 days straight. For the first 5 days, everything seemed okay. But then the subjects became deeply paranoid. They turned on each other. Their conversations just completely descended into madness. Then came the screaming. And then, just silence. When the researchers finally unsealed the chamber, what they found was a scene of just unimaginable horror. The subjects had literally torn themselves apart, performing these horrific acts of self-mutilation. And yet somehow, they were still alive. When soldiers tried to remove the last living subject from the chamber, he fought back with this insane superhuman strength. A researcher, terrified, asked him, "What are you?" And the subject smiled, a wide, bloody grin, and he gave his final, terrifying answer. "We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you all, begging to be free at every moment in your deepest animal mind." So there you have it. 4 stories. 4 completely different kinds of fear, and each one is like a perfect mirror for the anxieties of its time. And each one is this powerful, unsettling story that feels just plausible enough to send a real chill down your spine. I mean, think about the journey we just took. We went from the very real physical threat of a killer on a lonely road to the invasive terror of a home invasion, then to the psychological horror of a memory you can't even trust, and finally to the visceral dread of some lost scientific file you stumble across online. And what's so fascinating is that these 4 stories, each one passed around with a hushed "I swear this really happened to a friend of a friend," they are all perfect examples of classic, terrifying fiction. Yep. Every single one of them. The hook? A classic cautionary tale from the post-war era about teenage freedom. The Babysitter? That's an even older folklore that's been evolving for decades. Candle Cove? Not a repressed memory. It was a brilliant short story written by Chris Straub for an online forum. And The Russian Sleep Experiment? One of the most famous creepypastas, internet horror stories, ever written. They are all just brilliant pieces of fiction, perfectly designed to prey on our deepest anxieties. They are all just stories. But what happens when the story isn't fiction? What happens when the friend of a friend turns out to be telling the absolute truth? Well, in our final segment, we're going to investigate the shocking cases where the urban legend turned out to be real.
All right, so last time we were together, we tore apart all those classic legends, the ones that are totally compelling, totally terrifying, but, not real. We were left with this one final, really chilling question as we close the book on all that famous fiction.
Well, today, we're going to answer it. We are officially stepping through the looking glass. We're going into that deeply unsettling space where the campfire story you just laughed off becomes a news headline you just can't ignore.
Okay, let's get right into it. We've spent all this time working under the assumption that these are just stories, right? Just folklore. But the truth is, a really shocking number of them are actually rooted in bizarre, terrifying, and completely documented facts. So let's open up the case file.
First up, a true classic. You know the one. You check into a hotel room, maybe it's a little run down. There's this weird smell. You try to ignore it, brush it off. You sleep there all night, only to find out the next morning exactly where that awful smell was coming from.
I mean, it's the kind of story that makes you actually check under your own hotel bed, just in case, right? But could something so gruesome, something that sounds like it's straight out of a movie, could that really happen? The answer is a horrifying, resounding yes. And this isn't some one-in-a-million freak event. It has been confirmed multiple times. We have documented cases from Atlantic City all the way to Memphis, where guests at a budget lodge literally slept on a bed directly above the body of Sony Millbrook. The truth in this case is so much stranger and frankly way more disturbing than any story.
All right, let's open the next file. This one really preys on that idea of our most private, safe space, the bathroom. The thought of an intruder, not at the door, not at the window, but coming through the wall, right behind the mirror.
The movie Candyman made this idea famous and absolutely terrifying. But surely, this has to be just the product of a horror writer's overactive imagination, right? There's no way.
Nope, not even close. This legend is directly based on the truly tragic 1987 murder of a woman named Ruth McCoy. When investigators were looking into it, they discovered that in her Chicago housing project, the medicine cabinets, they were a known entry point for burglars. It was because of this weird design flaw that was meant to give plumbers access to the pipes. What started as a maintenance shortcut ended up becoming a fatal vulnerability.
Okay, case file number 3. This one just sounds like a dark comedy sketch. You've got this hotshot lawyer, and he's so incredibly confident in the state-of-the-art, shatterproof windows in his high-rise office building, he decides to prove how strong they are in the most dramatic way you can possibly imagine.
I mean, come on. It's got all the hallmarks of a cautionary tale, right? A story about pride coming before a fall. You tell a story like that to make a point about showing off. It's too perfect, too ironic to actually be true.
And yet, it really, really happened. The lawyer's name was Gary Hoy. On July 9, 1993, in Toronto, in front of a group of visiting law students who was trying to impress, he body-checked a window on the 24th floor. And get this, the window pane itself didn't even shatter. The whole thing just popped out of its frame, and Gary Hoy fell to his death.
Our final case file for today, oh boy, this one might just be the most macabre of them all. I want you to picture a haunted house or a carnival funhouse, and there's a dummy, hanging from a noose. It's a classic spooky prop. People are poking at it, laughing at it, until somebody realizes that's not a prop.
I mean, that's the ultimate creepy carnival trope, isn't it? The line between fake horror and real horror just blurring in the most unbelievable way. But it's got to be just a story, something to make the funhouse seem a little more dangerous, right?
The truth behind this one is honestly stranger than any fiction writer could ever dream up. The man's name was Elmer McCurdy. He was an outlaw who died in a shootout way back in 1911. Well, his embalmed body went on this bizarre, decades-long tour after his death as a sideshow attraction. And eventually, he was just mistaken for a mannequin and hung up in an amusement park. The truth only came out when a film crew for the $6 Million Man was shooting on location and his arm broke off.
So we've just seen all these bizarre, true stories that ballooned into these huge legends. It's like a one-way street from fact to folklore. But here's the twist. What if that street runs both ways? What happens when a story becomes so powerful that it actually reaches out from the page, or from the screen, and creates its own terrifying reality?
Well, there's actually a term for this. It's called ostension, and it's what happens when people take a story, a piece of folklore, and they physically act it out. They go legend tripping, they perform the ritual, they bring the story to life. And sometimes that has absolutely devastating consequences.
And maybe the most chilling modern example is Slender Man. Now remember, this wasn't some ancient myth from a dusty old book. This thing was born on an internet forum in 2009. It was pure fiction created by people online. But the story was just so powerful, it went so viral, that it became this new kind of folklore for the digital age. And then the line blurred completely. In 2014, in a truly horrifying act of what's called criminal ostension, two 12-year-old girls stabbed their friend because they truly believed they had to appease a monster that had only ever existed on a computer screen.
Wow, okay, so after everything we've just uncovered, let's take a step back for a second and just look at the entire journey we've been on together through this strange, strange world of urban legends.
You know, we started this whole thing by looking at the mechanics, how these stories even get started and how they spread. Then we dove into the psychology, the actual wiring in our brains that makes us so ready to believe these tales. After that, we revisited all the classics, the stories we all grew up hearing. And finally, today, we've had to confront the most unsettling part of it all, that undeniable, blurry line where story and reality crash into each other.
And it really leaves us with this final kind of lingering thought. If a real event can morph and mutate into a global legend, and a totally fictional story can inspire a real-world crime, it really makes you wonder, what stories are we a part of right now without even realizing it? And which ones are just waiting for their moment to cross over from fiction into fact?